Hello, and welcome to Real History Countdown. I'm Rebecca, and today the story of the British Empire is not just the story of a nation expanding across the seas, but the story of how a relatively small island kingdom transformed into one of the largest and most influential powers the world has ever seen, shaping politics, economics, culture, and society on a global scale. To understand the rise of the British Empire, we must first understand Britain itself in the late medieval and early modern world. In the 15th century, England and Scotland were separate kingdoms, each with their own monarchs and rivalries, while Wales had already been brought under English control through conquest centuries earlier. The British Isles were not yet united, and their strength compared to continental Europe was modest. Spain, Portugal, and France dominated European power politics, with vast armies, wealth from trade, and a head start in overseas exploration. But Britain, isolated by the sea, would eventually turn this geographic limitation into its greatest advantage. Maritime power, commerce, and naval dominance became the tools through which the British would build their empire. The roots of overseas expansion began with the Age of Discovery. Inspired by the voyages of Columbus under Spain and Vasco da Gama under Portugal, English explorers in the late 15th and 16th centuries began to push outward. One of the earliest figures was John Cabot, a Venetian navigator sailing under the English flag, who in 1497 reached the coasts of Newfoundland, opening the door to English claims in the New World. However, England at this stage lacked the resources and political stability to pursue large-scale colonization. The Wars of the Roses had only just ended, leaving the country exhausted, and the Tudors, beginning with Henry VII and Henry VIII, focused more on consolidating domestic authority than building overseas dominions. Still, private adventurers and merchants were beginning to look outward, seeking fortunes through trade, piracy, and exploration. During the reign of Elizabeth I in the late 16th century, the seeds of empire began to take firmer root. England challenged the dominance of Catholic Spain, whose empire stretched across the Americas. English privateers like Francis Drake raided Spanish treasure fleets, enriching England and weakening Spain. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 became a turning point, as England proved it could hold its own against the strongest naval power of the age. With Spain's decline slowly beginning, the door opened wider for English expansion. Colonization efforts began in earnest, though they were not without failure. The Roanoke colony, established in the 1580s in what is now North Carolina, famously disappeared without a trace, a lost colony that underscored the dangers and uncertainties of early colonization. Yet lessons were learned, and the determination to create a permanent English presence overseas did not fade. The 17th century saw the first true beginnings of what would later become the British Empire. In 1607, Jamestown was founded in Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in North America. It was followed by Plymouth in 1620, established by the Pilgrims. These colonies, fragile at first, would grow over time, bringing English settlers, institutions, and culture to the New World. The motivation for these colonies was mixed. Some were driven by the promise of profit through tobacco and other cash crops, others by religious freedom, as seen with the Puritans in New England. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, English adventurers seized valuable islands like Barbados and Jamaica, which became centers of sugar production, built on the back of enslaved African labor. The transatlantic slave trade, which would become one of the darkest aspects of the British Empire, tied together the triangular exchange of goods, slaves, and raw materials between Africa, the Americas, and Europe, enriching merchants and fueling Britain's rise. At the same time, the East became another theater of expansion. The East India Company, chartered in 1600, marked the beginning of English involvement in Asia. Initially a trading company, it sought spices, textiles, and other exotic goods from the Indian Ocean region. Competing with the powerful Dutch East India Company, the English gradually secured footholds in India, establishing trading posts in Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. These outposts, at first mere factories and warehouses, would later evolve into the foundation of British dominance in the Indian subcontinent. The East India Company operated as a semi-private empire, wielding not only commercial but also political and military power, a sign of how Britain's empire was often built through a combination of state sanction and private enterprise. The growth of colonies was not smooth or inevitable. England faced challenges at home, including the civil wars of the 1640s, the execution of Charles I, and the turbulent rule of Oliver Cromwell. Yet, even in this period of internal strife, overseas expansion continued. Cromwell's Western design in the 1650s targeted the Spanish Caribbean, leading to the conquest of Jamaica in 1655. The Navigation Acts, a series of laws passed beginning in 1651, sought to regulate colonial trade, ensuring that English ships and merchants benefited most from the growing Atlantic economy. These acts laid the groundwork for the mercantile system, in which colonies existed to enrich the mother country. The result was tension, as colonies often felt restricted by London's control, a dynamic that would eventually have far-reaching consequences. By the late 17th century, England's imperial ambitions were unmistakable. Rivalries with the Dutch, French, and Spanish played out on both European and colonial battlefields. Wars like the Anglo-Dutch Wars demonstrated England's determination to dominate maritime trade routes, while conflicts with France in North America, known as King William's War and Queen Anne's War, reflected the struggle for supremacy in the New World. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 marked a significant milestone, as Britain gained territories like Gibraltar and Newfoundland, as well as the Asiento, the lucrative right to supply slaves to Spanish America. Each gain added to Britain's growing global presence. It is important to remember that empire at this stage was not yet a centralized, coordinated project. Colonies were scattered, often founded by private companies or groups rather than the crown itself, and their success varied widely. Some thrived, like the Sugar Islands of the Caribbean, generating immense wealth, while others struggled with conflict, disease, or native resistance. Yet taken together, these scattered holdings formed the beginnings of a global network. The empire was not only territorial but also commercial, with Britain's merchants, ships, and financiers increasingly tied into a worldwide economy. London began to emerge as a global financial hub, its banks and insurers facilitating the risky but profitable ventures of overseas trade. By the turn of the 18th century, the outlines of the British Empire were visible. In North America, a string of colonies stretched along the Atlantic seaboard. In the Caribbean, islands produced sugar for European markets. In Africa, forts and trading posts dotted the coast, facilitating the slave trade. In India, the East India Company's outposts laid the groundwork for deeper involvement. And at sea, the Royal Navy, though not yet unrivaled, was growing in power and professionalism, soon to become the backbone of imperial expansion. The empire was still young, still fragile in many respects, but the foundations had been laid for what would become the largest empire the world had ever seen. The centuries ahead would see Britain's empire reach astonishing heights, bringing both immense wealth and devastating consequences to the peoples and lands it touched. The early chapters of the British Empire's history thus reveal a story of ambition, experimentation, and conflict. From tentative exploration under the Tudors to the establishment of colonies in the Americas, from the rise of the East India Company in Asia to the wars of the 17th century, Britain was carving out a place for itself on the global stage. Much of this expansion was driven not only by the crown but also by private merchants, adventurers, and companies, whose pursuit of profit meshed with the broader ambitions of national power. The empire was never a single-planned project. It grew organically, shaped by opportunity, conflict, and circumstance. Yet by 1700, Britain had taken its first steps toward global empire, steps that would, over the next 2 centuries, carry it to unprecedented heights. The world was beginning to feel the impact of British expansion, and the story was only just beginning. The 18th century was the century in which Britain's empire truly began to transform from a scattered collection of overseas possessions into a global power that could rival, and eventually surpass, the great continental empires of France and Spain. The foundation laid in the 17th century with colonies in North America, the Caribbean, and trading posts in India was now ready to expand in scale and significance. Britain entered this century with a stronger navy, a growing merchant class, and an evolving political system that increasingly allowed Parliament and financiers in London to shape imperial policy alongside the monarchy. It was in this era that Britain's empire would become deeply intertwined with war, commerce, and industrial development, setting the stage for its dominance in the 19th century. At the dawn of the 1700s, Britain's empire was still modest compared to what it would become. The colonies along the Atlantic seaboard of North America were steadily growing in population, with settlers carving out towns, farms, and trade networks. The Caribbean islands were booming, producing immense wealth through sugar plantations reliant on enslaved African labor. The triangular trade that linked Britain, Africa, and the Americas grew ever more profitable, with ships carrying manufactured goods from Britain to Africa, slaves from Africa to the Americas, and raw goods like sugar, tobacco, and cotton back to Britain. This system enriched merchants and investors, but it also entrenched slavery as a brutal foundation of the imperial economy, a reality that would remain for over a century. Meanwhile, the East India Company continued to expand its reach in India, often clashing with the powerful Mughal Empire and competing European traders. At first, the British were minor players in India compared to the Portuguese, Dutch, and French, but events in the coming decades would tilt the balance dramatically in their favor. War was the constant companion of empire, and the 18th century was dominated by a series of major conflicts between European powers that spilled into colonial theaters. The War of the Spanish Succession at the start of the century saw Britain aligned against France and Spain. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 marked a significant gain for Britain, as it acquired Gibraltar and Minorca in the Mediterranean, Newfoundland and Nova Scotia in North America, and the Asiento Contract to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish America. Gibraltar, in particular, became a crucial naval base, giving Britain a permanent strategic foothold at the entrance to the Mediterranean. These acquisitions signaled that Britain was now thinking about empire not just in terms of colonies, but also in terms of global naval dominance. The growing rivalry with France defined much of Britain's imperial expansion during this century. Both nations competed fiercely in North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. This competition culminated in the 7 Years' War, fought from 1756 to 1763, often described as the first truly global conflict. In North America, it was known as the French and Indian War, as British colonists and their Native American allies clashed with French forces and their indigenous partners. The war also raged in Europe, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India. For Britain, this was a war of destiny. Under the leadership of William Pitt the Elder, Britain poured resources into its navy and global campaigns, determined to wrest supremacy from France. The results were extraordinary. In North America, British forces captured Quebec in 1759, a decisive victory that led to the eventual fall of French Canada. In India, Robert Clive and the East India Company defeated the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, a turning point that secured British control over Bengal, one of the richest provinces in India. The Royal Navy dominated at sea, seizing key French and Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and elsewhere. By the time the war ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, Britain had emerged as the world's leading colonial power. The territorial gains were staggering. Britain now controlled Canada, Florida, ceded by Spain, and much of India. The French were left with only small islands and trading posts, their imperial ambitions shattered. Britain's empire stretched across the globe, and its navy ensured the security of its trade routes. Yet with great expansion came new challenges. Governing vast new territories required resources and administration, and the costs of war had left Britain with a massive debt. To raise revenue, Parliament began taxing the American colonies more directly, introducing measures like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. The colonists, who had grown accustomed to a degree of autonomy, resisted fiercely, arguing that they were being taxed without representation. What had once been a proud set of colonies under the British flag now became increasingly resentful of London's control. The American Revolution erupted in 1775, becoming one of the greatest crises the British Empire had ever faced. The 13 colonies, supported by France and later Spain, fought for independence against Britain's armies and navy. Despite initial advantages, Britain found itself stretched thin, fighting across a vast continent against a determined population. The surrender at Yorktown in 1781 effectively sealed the fate of British rule in America. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 formally recognized the independence of the United States. For Britain, the loss of the American colonies was a devastating blow, shattering the idea of an empire built on settler colonies in the Americas. Many in Europe believed this marked the decline of Britain as an imperial power. Yet paradoxically, the loss of America forced Britain to turn more decisively toward Asia, Africa, and the Pacific, regions that would eventually form the backbone of its empire in the 19th century. Even during the American crisis, Britain's empire was not collapsing. In India, the East India Company's power grew rapidly. After Plassey, the company expanded its control, collecting taxes, raising armies, and effectively ruling vast territories. The wealth of Bengal flowed into Britain, fueling its economy and financing its wars. The company's influence grew so immense that it operated like a state within a state until corruption and mismanagement forced Parliament to begin regulating it more closely through acts in the late 18th century. India was becoming the jewel of Britain's empire, though its full incorporation would come in the next century. In the Caribbean, sugar plantations continued to generate wealth, while in Africa, the slave trade remained central to imperial commerce. The Navy maintained Britain's dominance at sea, ensuring that despite losing America, Britain's empire remained strong. The end of the 18th century also saw the rise of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, a transformation that would give it unprecedented economic and technological power. Factories, mechanized production, and steam engines revolutionized industry, creating a demand for raw materials and markets overseas. Empire and industry fed each other, as Britain's colonies supplied cotton, sugar, and other commodities, while British goods flooded global markets. This gave the empire a new economic dynamism, making it less dependent on colonies of settlement like America and more focused on trade, exploitation, and resource extraction. The French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars at the turn of the 19th century again placed Britain in a global struggle, this time against revolutionary France. The wars were long, brutal, and expensive, but Britain's navy under Admiral Nelson ensured victory at key battles like Trafalgar in 1805. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, Britain stood supreme. France's empire was shattered. Spain's colonies in Latin America were breaking away, and Britain's global reach was unmatched. From Canada to India, from the Caribbean to Africa, the British Empire had survived its greatest tests and emerged stronger than ever, poised to enter the 19th century as the dominant world power. Thus, the 18th century was both a time of triumph and of loss for the British Empire. Triumph in the 7 Years' War had made Britain the leading global empire, with unparalleled naval and territorial strength. Loss came with the American Revolution, stripping Britain of its oldest and most populous colonies. Yet rather than signaling decline, this loss forced a reorientation that ultimately strengthened the empire. India's growing importance, the wealth of the Caribbean, the dominance of the Royal Navy, and the beginnings of industrial might all ensured that Britain would enter the 19th century more powerful than ever. The empire had shifted its center of gravity from the Atlantic seaboard of North America to the vast riches of Asia and beyond. The stage was set for Britain's empire to reach its zenith, ruling over a quarter of the world's land and people in the century to come. The 19th century was the age in which the British Empire reached its zenith, the high point of what would later be called the Pax Britannica, the British peace, an era in which Britain was not only the largest empire in history, but also the global hegemon whose navy, commerce, and diplomacy shaped the world. By 1815, following the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo, Britain stood alone as the supreme global power. France had been humbled. Spain's American colonies were breaking away into independence, and the Dutch and Portuguese empires were shadows of their former selves. The British Empire had survived centuries of rivalry and emerged as the dominant force, with an empire that now spanned continents. Yet the story of this century is not just one of triumph and power, but also of contradictions, wealth and exploitation, progress and oppression, reform and resistance. At the heart of Britain's global dominance was the Royal Navy. By the early 19th century, the Navy was unrivaled. Its control of the seas gave Britain the ability to protect its trade routes, enforce its policies, and deter rivals. The phrase "Britannia rules the waves" was no idle boast but a statement of fact. The Royal Navy was the shield of empire, ensuring that British merchants, ships, and soldiers could travel freely across the oceans, linking together colonies that were scattered across the globe. This naval supremacy also gave Britain a unique ability to project power far beyond its shores, to intervene in conflicts on distant continents, and to enforce its interests on an unprecedented scale. India emerged as the jewel of the crown, the centerpiece of Britain's imperial project. The East India Company, which had gradually expanded its control in the 18th century, became the de facto ruler of large parts of India. Through wars, alliances, and annexations, the company extended its authority until it governed vast territories, raising armies composed largely of Indian soldiers, known as sepoys. India became not only a source of immense wealth through the export of textiles, opium, and other goods, but also a vital strategic asset. Yet company rule was marked by corruption, exploitation, and insensitivity to Indian traditions and religions. In 1857, resentment boiled over in the Great Indian Rebellion, also called the Sepoy Mutiny, when Indian soldiers rose against their British officers, sparked by cultural and religious grievances, but fueled by deeper discontent with British domination. The rebellion was brutal, with atrocities on both sides, and though it was crushed, it shook Britain to its core. In its aftermath, the East India Company was dissolved, and India came under direct rule by the British Crown, with Queen Victoria proclaimed Empress of India in 1877. The Raj, as British rule in India came to be known, would last until 1947, making India both the pride and the burden of the empire. While India was the central jewel, the empire expanded dramatically elsewhere. In Australia, what had begun as a penal colony at Botany Bay in 1788 grew into a settler society. Convicts, free settlers, and immigrants transformed Australia into a series of colonies that eventually federated into a dominion. The indigenous Aboriginal peoples suffered devastating losses from disease, displacement, and violence as British settlements spread. In New Zealand, British colonization accelerated after the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, though disputes over land and sovereignty led to the New Zealand Wars between settlers and the Maori. In Canada, the colonies of British North America gradually developed greater autonomy, culminating in the Confederation of 1867, which united them into the Dominion of Canada, still loyal to the Crown but self-governing. These settler colonies, populated largely by people of European descent, were seen as extensions of Britain itself, part of a Greater Britain that would eventually form the basis of the Commonwealth. Africa, too, became increasingly important to the empire in the 19th century. Initially, Britain's involvement in Africa was largely coastal, tied to the slave trade. But with the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in the British colonies in 1833, Britain's role shifted. The Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron patrolled the Atlantic to suppress the trade, capturing slave ships and freeing thousands of enslaved Africans, though often resettling them in Sierra Leone under British oversight. In the latter half of the century, as European powers scrambled to carve up Africa, Britain seized vast territories. Egypt, though technically part of the Ottoman Empire, came under British control after the occupation of 1882, largely to secure the Suez Canal, a vital route to India. In southern Africa, Britain clashed with the Dutch-descended Boers and the powerful Zulu kingdom, leading to wars of conquest and the eventual creation of colonies like Natal and the Cape Colony. By the end of the century, Britain controlled swathes of Africa from Egypt to South Africa and from Nigeria to Kenya, though often through violence and exploitation of local populations. The empire also stretched into the Pacific and Asia beyond India. Hong Kong was ceded to Britain after the First Opium War in 1842, following Britain's victory over China in a conflict fought largely to enforce Britain's lucrative but devastating opium trade. Further expansion in Asia included Malaya, Burma, and later parts of the Pacific Islands. Everywhere the British went, they imposed their political and economic systems, often justified by a sense of racial superiority and a belief in the so-called civilizing mission. The ideology of empire was wrapped in notions of progress, Christianity, and civilization, yet the reality was often one of exploitation, forced labor, and cultural suppression. Economically, the 19th century was the age of British industrial and financial dominance. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain, gave it a massive head start over other nations. British factories produced textiles, machinery, and manufactured goods that were exported worldwide. Colonies provided both the raw materials, cotton from India and Egypt, rubber from Malaya, wool from Australia, and the markets to consume these goods. London became the financial capital of the world, with banks, insurers, and investors managing global flows of capital. The gold standard, first adopted by Britain, spread globally, reflecting Britain's dominance in finance. Railways, telegraphs, and steamships tied the empire together, shrinking distances and speeding communication and transport. This was the infrastructure of empire, a network that allowed Britain to manage a global system more efficiently than any empire before it. Yet this wealth and power were built on deep inequalities. Colonies often saw their economies distorted to serve Britain's needs, with local industries suppressed in favor of British imports. Famines in India, such as those in the late 19th century, were exacerbated by British policies that prioritized export over local subsistence. Indigenous peoples in Australia, New Zealand, Africa, and the Americas faced dispossession and cultural destruction. Even in Britain, the riches of empire did not prevent social unrest, as industrial workers faced poor conditions, prompting movements for reform and labor rights. The empire was not a monolithic force of progress, but a complex system of power, exploitation, and contradiction. Culturally, the 19th century was also the age of imperial confidence. Writers, explorers, and missionaries celebrated the empire as a force for good, spreading English language, law, and institutions. Figures like Rudyard Kipling embodied this ideology in works that glorified empire, while Christian missionaries spread their faith across Africa and Asia. At the same time, critics of empire grew louder. Abolitionists, reformers, and early anti-imperial voices questioned the morality of domination and exploitation. In the colonies themselves, resistance movements began to stir, from Indian intellectuals demanding reform to African leaders resisting conquest. The empire inspired loyalty in some, resentment in many, and resistance in countless others. Politically, Britain developed a system of varying levels of control across its empire. Settler colonies like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand gained dominion status, with self-government under the Crown. India remained under direct rule, tightly controlled by a bureaucracy and the army. African and Asian colonies were governed as dependencies, with little say for local populations. This patchwork reflected the empire's diversity, but also its fragility. It was not a single cohesive structure, but a collection of territories held together by naval power, economic interests, and a belief in imperial destiny. By the end of the 19th century, the British Empire covered nearly a quarter of the world's land and ruled over hundreds of millions of people. It was the largest empire in history, unmatched in size, wealth, and influence. Yet cracks were beginning to show. Nationalist movements in India, Ireland, and elsewhere were gaining momentum. Rival powers like Germany and the United States were industrializing rapidly, challenging Britain's economic supremacy. The scramble for Africa brought Britain into conflict with other European empires, setting the stage for future rivalries. The empire had reached its greatest heights, but it was also sowing the seeds of the struggles that would define the 20th century. The 19th century British Empire was thus a paradox. It was the engine of global trade and the center of financial power, but also a system of domination and inequality. It spread railways, telegraphs, and industrial modernity, but also brought famine, cultural destruction, and war. It celebrated ideals of freedom and liberty at home, while denying them to millions abroad. It inspired pride in many Britons and resentment in many colonized peoples. Above all, it was vast, complex, and transformative, shaping the modern world in ways that remain visible today. By 1900, the sun truly never set on the British Empire, but the dawn of the 20th century would bring new challenges, new wars, and the beginning of decline for the greatest empire the world had ever known. The 20th century began with the British Empire at its territorial height, the largest empire in human history, ruling over 1/4 of the world's land and population. From Canada to Australia, from India to Africa, from the Caribbean to the Pacific, Britain's red-colored territories on the map gave rise to the famous phrase that the sun never set on the British Empire. Yet beneath this appearance of unrivaled strength, forces were already stirring that would make the new century far more turbulent and ultimately lead to the decline and dissolution of Britain's imperial dominance. Nationalism, economic competition, global wars, and the rise of new powers would transform the empire from its position of unmatched authority to a shadow of its former self by the century's end. At the dawn of the 1900s, Britain was still the world's financial center and the Royal Navy still ruled the seas. London banks and investors controlled capital flows, and British trade networks stretched across the globe. Yet other powers were rising quickly. The United States, after its Industrial Revolution and westward expansion, was emerging as a new global power. Germany, recently unified, had built a powerful army and a modern navy, directly challenging Britain's supremacy. Japan, too, had rapidly modernized, defeating China in 1895 and Russia in 1905, signaling that the global order was shifting. Britain still stood tall, but for the first time in centuries, it faced competitors that could threaten its global dominance. The empire faced major challenges within its own territories as well. In South Africa, the Boer Wars between 1899 and 1902 tested Britain's military and moral reputation. Fighting against Dutch-descended settlers who resisted British control, Britain deployed massive forces and ultimately won, but only after employing harsh tactics, including scorched earth policies and the establishment of concentration camps where Boer civilians suffered greatly. The war revealed the costs of empire, both in blood and reputation, and highlighted the determination of local populations to resist British rule. South Africa would eventually be incorporated into the empire as a self-governing dominion, but the war left scars that never fully healed. Then came the cataclysm of World War I. When the war broke out in 1914, Britain called upon its empire to support the struggle against Germany and the Central Powers. Troops from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Africa, and the Caribbean fought and died in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. The empire's resources, food, materials, manpower, were mobilized on a massive scale. The Gallipoli campaign in 1915 saw Australian and New Zealand forces fight with distinction, though at great cost, cementing their national identities. Indian soldiers fought bravely on the Western Front and in the deserts of Mesopotamia. The empire was a crucial part of Britain's war effort, proving both its reach and its reliance on colonial subjects. When the war ended in 1918, Britain emerged victorious, but at an immense cost. Nearly 1 million British and Imperial soldiers were dead, the economy was deeply strained, and the illusion of invulnerability was shattered. The post-war settlement expanded Britain's empire even further, at least on paper. Through the League of Nations mandate system, Britain acquired former German and Ottoman territories, including Palestine, Iraq, and Tanganyika. The empire now stretched into the Middle East, controlling oil-rich regions that would prove strategically vital in the decades ahead. Yet the reality was that Britain was exhausted. The war had drained its finances, weakened its industries, and left it heavily indebted, particularly to the United States. The empire was larger than ever, but it was increasingly difficult to sustain. The interwar years revealed the growing fragility of the empire. Nationalist movements gained strength across the colonies. In India, the independence movement under leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru grew rapidly. Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent resistance, embodied in campaigns like the Salt March of 1930, inspired millions of Indians to demand freedom from British rule. Though Britain attempted reforms and concessions, such as the Government of India Act of 1935, the demand for full independence only grew stronger. In the Middle East, Britain faced unrest in Palestine and Iraq, as Arabs resisted both colonial control and the growing tensions caused by promises made to both Jews and Arabs during the war. In Africa and the Caribbean, educated elites and workers began forming nationalist movements, inspired by the global wave of anti-colonial sentiment. Economically, the Great Depression of the 1930s hit the empire hard. Trade contracted, unemployment rose, and many colonies saw hardship increase. Britain sought to bind the empire more closely through economic policies like imperial preference, which gave favorable trade terms to imperial markets. Yet this only highlighted the dependence of colonies on Britain and reinforced inequalities that fueled resentment. Meanwhile, rival powers were growing more aggressive. Germany under Hitler, Italy under Mussolini, and Japan under militarist leaders sought to expand their own empires, directly challenging Britain's global position. World War II was the decisive turning point for the British Empire. When war broke out in 1939, Britain once again called upon its empire, and once again soldiers from India, Africa, Canada, Australia, and elsewhere fought across the globe. The war stretched the empire to its limits. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany in 1940 after the fall of France, relying on its navy, air force, and empire to survive. The Battle of Britain showcased the resilience of the Royal Air Force, while the convoys that kept Britain supplied depended heavily on imperial contributions. In Asia, Japan struck in 1941, capturing British possessions like Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and Burma in rapid succession. The fall of Singapore was described by Winston Churchill as the greatest disaster in British military history, shattering the aura of British invincibility in Asia. Millions of colonial subjects endured hardship, occupation, and famine during the war. Despite these crises, Britain emerged from World War II on the winning side, but the empire was fatally weakened. The war had bankrupted Britain, leaving it dependent on American loans and aid. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the new superpowers, while Britain's global role diminished. Most importantly, colonial subjects who had fought and sacrificed during the war returned home with heightened expectations of freedom and self-determination. The empire that had once claimed to bring progress and civilization now faced widespread demands for independence. The first great wave of decolonization began almost immediately after the war. In 1947, India, the jewel of the crown, finally achieved independence, though partition divided the subcontinent into India and Pakistan, leading to horrific violence and mass migrations. Gandhi's dream of a peaceful transition was shattered by communal bloodshed, but the British Raj was over. India's independence marked the symbolic beginning of the end of the British Empire. Other colonies soon followed. In 1948, Burma and Ceylon, Sri Lanka, gained independence. In the Middle East, Palestine was relinquished in 1948, leading to the creation of Israel and ongoing conflict in the region. Across Africa, nationalist movements gathered momentum, though independence would come more gradually in the 1950s and 1960s. Britain still retained colonies in the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia, but the tide was clearly turning. Even in the settler dominions, the relationship with Britain was changing. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa had long enjoyed self-government, but during and after World War II, they increasingly asserted their independence in foreign policy and identity. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 had already given them full legislative independence, and by the mid-20th century they were functioning as fully sovereign nations, though still part of the Commonwealth. The empire was evolving into something different, no longer an unquestioned structure of control, but a network of states seeking looser connections under shared traditions. By 1950, the British Empire was no longer what it had been at the dawn of the century. It remained vast, but it was weakened, challenged, and on the defensive. The age of unquestioned dominance had ended. Nationalism in the colonies, the rise of the United States and Soviet Union, and Britain's own economic struggles all combined to make imperial retreat inevitable. Yet the story of the empire was not over. The coming decades would see the final unraveling of Britain's imperial power as Africa and the Caribbean joined Asia in winning independence, and as Britain sought to redefine its role in the world through the Commonwealth and new alliances. The 20th century would not only witness the decline of empire, but also its transformation, leaving behind a complex legacy that still shapes global politics and cultures today. The middle decades of the 20th century were the era in which the British Empire finally unraveled, its once vast dominion giving way to a wave of independence movements that swept across Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia. By 1960, the empire that had once claimed to rule a quarter of the world's people was dissolving rapidly as one colony after another declared independence. The shift was not sudden but had been building for decades, accelerated by World War II and its aftermath. Britain, exhausted and financially weakened, could no longer maintain the costs of empire, nor could it justify colonial domination in an age of rising nationalism, self-determination, and Cold War competition. The transformation was not only geopolitical but psychological, as Britain itself had to come to terms with the end of empire and redefine its role in a world now dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union. The symbolic moment that announced Britain's post-war decline on the global stage was the Suez Crisis of 1956. Egypt's nationalist leader Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital waterway that Britain and France considered essential for their economic and strategic interests. In response, Britain, France, and Israel launched a military intervention to retake the canal. Yet the operation quickly collapsed under international pressure, particularly from the United States and the Soviet Union, both of whom opposed the intervention. Forced into a humiliating withdrawal, Britain was confronted with the reality that it was no longer a superpower capable of acting independently. The Suez Crisis was a watershed, exposing Britain's diminished status and symbolizing the twilight of empire. After Suez, even many in Britain acknowledged that the days of imperial grandeur were over. At the same time, independence movements were sweeping through Africa. In the Gold Coast, Kwame Nkrumah led a powerful campaign for self-rule, and in 1957 the colony became the independent nation of Ghana, the first sub-Saharan African country to break free of colonial rule. This set off a domino effect. Nigeria gained independence in 1960, followed by Sierra Leone, Tanganyika, Uganda, and many others throughout the 1960s. Britain sought to manage these transitions peacefully when possible, negotiating independence agreements and attempting to leave behind stable governments. Yet the process was not always smooth. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising in the 1950s challenged British authority through armed resistance, and the brutal counterinsurgency left deep scars. In Rhodesia, later Zimbabwe, white minority settlers resisted majority rule, leading to a protracted conflict that only ended with independence in 1980. Across the continent, independence was a mix of celebration and struggle, as newly sovereign nations faced the challenges of development, unity, and the legacies of colonial rule. The Caribbean, too, experienced a wave of decolonization. Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago gained independence in 1962, followed by Barbados in 1966 and other islands throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Some, like Bermuda and the Cayman Islands, chose to remain British overseas territories, but the general movement was toward independence. In the Pacific, colonies like Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands achieved sovereignty in the 1970s. Each independence movement reflected the broader global tide of decolonization, as peoples across the empire demanded the right to govern themselves, often inspired by the struggles of others and supported by international institutions like the United Nations. As Britain withdrew, the empire was gradually transformed into the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of former colonies and dominions that chose to maintain ties with Britain and with each other. The Commonwealth, though lacking the coercive power of empire, became a symbolic and sometimes practical link, promoting cooperation in trade, culture, and diplomacy. It was a way for Britain to maintain influence and relationships in a post-imperial world, though it was a far cry from the dominance it had once enjoyed. The British monarch remained a figurehead for many Commonwealth realms, including Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, reflecting the enduring legacy of imperial ties even after political independence. The retreat from empire was not without moments of crisis. In 1982, Britain fought the Falklands War against Argentina after Argentine forces invaded the disputed islands in the South Atlantic. Britain's victory, though costly, revived a brief sense of imperial pride and demonstrated that Britain still retained some global military capacity. Yet the Falklands War was more a symbolic episode than a sign of enduring imperial power. By this time, the empire had largely dissolved, leaving only a handful of overseas territories scattered across the globe, from Gibraltar to Bermuda to the Falklands themselves. For Britain, the end of empire forced a redefinition of national identity. No longer the center of a vast empire, Britain turned increasingly toward Europe, joining the European Economic Community in 1973, while also maintaining its special relationship with the United States. Domestically, the influx of immigrants from former colonies transformed British society. People from the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa migrated to Britain in large numbers, bringing cultural diversity, but also sparking tensions and debates over race, immigration, and identity. The legacy of empire was thus not only political and economic, but also deeply embedded in British culture, shaping debates about what it meant to be British in a post-imperial age. The final decades of the 20th century saw the last remnants of empire continue to disappear. Hong Kong, Britain's most important remaining colony, was handed back to China in 1997 under a unique arrangement known as One Country, Two Systems. This marked the end of Britain's formal empire in Asia and symbolized the closure of a chapter that had begun with the East India Company centuries earlier. After Hong Kong, only small territories remained, such as Gibraltar, the Falklands, and various island possessions, collectively known as the British Overseas Territories. These areas, while strategically or economically significant in some cases, were a far cry from the days when Britain ruled India, Canada, and vast stretches of Africa. The transformation from empire to post-empire left Britain with a complicated legacy. On one hand, the empire had spread the English language, legal systems, and parliamentary traditions across much of the world, leaving behind institutions that many newly independent nations retained. On the other hand, The empire had also inflicted deep wounds: slavery, exploitation, cultural suppression, and economic dependency that continued to shape post-colonial societies. The memory of empire was celebrated by some as a source of pride and continuity, while condemned by others as a legacy of oppression and injustice. Britain itself struggled with this duality, as nostalgia for imperial greatness coexisted with the realities of decline and adaptation. By the close of the 20th century, the British Empire as a political entity was gone, replaced by a smaller Britain still searching for its place in a world where power had shifted to other hands. The United States had long since become the dominant Western power, while the European Union provided a new framework for Britain's international engagement. The Commonwealth survived as a loose association, but it could not replicate the structures of empire. Britain's global influence remained significant through finance, culture, diplomacy, and military alliances, but it was influence of a different kind: softer, less commanding, more dependent on cooperation than coercion. The empire, once the defining feature of Britain's identity, was now a memory, a legacy, and a subject of debate rather than a living reality. The 21st century dawned without the British Empire as a political structure, but its legacy continued to echo across the globe in countless ways. The empire had formally ended, but its imprint on language, culture, politics, economics, and identity remained deeply embedded in the modern world. Britain itself, long past the age of imperial grandeur, now occupied a new place in global affairs, no longer the center of an empire on which the sun never set, but still a nation of significant influence, shaped both by the memory of empire and by the realities of post-imperial life. To speak of the empire in the present day is to confront both pride and pain, nostalgia and criticism, as the debate over what the British Empire meant, and what it still means, continues to unfold. One of the most obvious legacies of empire is language. English, once the tongue of a small island people, became through empire the global lingua franca. Today, English is the dominant language of international business, diplomacy, science, and culture, spoken by billions worldwide. From India to Nigeria, from Canada to Australia, English spread through the institutions of empire and remained as a common thread linking diverse peoples. The empire also left behind systems of governance, law, and education that shaped many former colonies. Parliamentary democracy, common law, and civil service structures introduced under British rule were adopted, adapted, or reformed by newly independent nations, creating a legacy that continues to define political life in places as varied as India, Kenya, and Jamaica. Yet this inheritance was not always positive, as colonial boundaries drawn by Britain often ignored ethnic or cultural realities, creating divisions and conflicts that persisted long after independence. Economically, the empire created networks of trade and finance that still shape the global economy. London remains a global financial center, in part because of its historic role as the heart of the imperial system. The Commonwealth of Nations, though largely symbolic, maintains economic and cultural links between former colonies and Britain. Migration, too, is a living legacy of empire. The post-war arrival of immigrants from the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa reshaped British society, making modern Britain a multicultural nation. The contributions of these communities enriched British culture, music, food, and politics, but also sparked tensions and debates over identity, integration, and the meaning of being British in a post-imperial age. The Windrush generation, arriving from the Caribbean in the late 1940s and 1950s, symbolized both the opportunities and the struggles of this new era, as immigrants helped rebuild Britain while also facing racism and discrimination. Globally, the empire's shadow is visible in borders, conflicts, and cultural connections. The partition of India in 1947, a decision taken by British authorities during decolonization, created lasting tensions between India and Pakistan, leading to wars and continuing disputes, particularly over Kashmir. In the Middle East, Britain's mandates and promises during and after World War I left behind unresolved conflicts, including in Palestine, where competing commitments to Jews and Arabs laid the foundation for decades of strife. In Africa, colonial boundaries grouped together diverse peoples, leading to internal conflicts in countries like Nigeria and Sudan. These problems were not solely the result of empire, but imperial decisions often exacerbated them, leaving challenges that persist into the present. At the same time, there are positive legacies remembered in former colonies. Railways, legal systems, and education structures introduced under empire provided foundations for development in some regions. Cricket, a sport exported from Britain, became a passion in countries like India, Pakistan, and the West Indies, transforming into a cultural symbol of post-colonial pride. The English language itself became a tool for global communication and literature, as writers from across the former empire used it to express their own voices and perspectives, often reinterpreting and challenging the narratives of empire. Figures like Chinua Achebe, Salman Rushdie, and Derek Walcott embodied this post-colonial literary flowering, turning the language of the colonizer into a medium of critique and creativity. In Britain itself, the legacy of empire remains contested. Some view the empire as a source of pride, remembering the technological, cultural, and political achievements associated with it. Others emphasize its darker sides: slavery, exploitation, famine, and cultural destruction. Debates over statues, memorials, and history curricula reveal how deeply the empire's memory continues to divide opinion. Movements like Black Lives Matter have reignited discussions about Britain's role in the transatlantic slave trade and the need to confront uncomfortable truths about empire. Universities, museums, and cultural institutions face growing pressure to acknowledge how their collections and wealth were tied to colonialism. The question of how Britain should remember its empire, whether with pride, regret, or critical reflection, remains unresolved. The transition from empire to Commonwealth provided one way for Britain to maintain connections. The Commonwealth, with over 50 member states, includes nations from every continent, united not by coercion but by shared history and voluntary association. Its role is largely symbolic, promoting cooperation in areas like education, trade, and human rights. For some, it represents a positive legacy of empire, a network of nations that chose to maintain ties despite the end of colonial rule. For others, it is a reminder of past domination, a soft echo of imperial influence. The British monarch remains head of the Commonwealth, though republican movements in Australia, the Caribbean, and elsewhere challenge even this symbolic link. In the 21st century, Britain's global role has continued to evolve. The end of empire forced Britain to integrate more closely with Europe, joining the European Union in the 1970s, though Brexit in 2016 reopened debates about identity, sovereignty, and Britain's place in the world. Some advocates of Brexit invoked imperial nostalgia, imagining a global Britain trading freely with the world as in the days of empire. Yet the reality is that the empire cannot be resurrected, and Britain's power today is far more limited. Still, the networks created by empire, the English language, Commonwealth ties, migration flows, and financial links remain valuable assets in Britain's global engagement. For former colonies, the empire's legacy is equally complex. Some nations, like India, have risen to become global powers in their own right, building on but also moving beyond their colonial past. Others continue to struggle with the legacies of artificial borders, economic dependency, or political instability linked to colonial rule. The memory of empire is woven into national identities, sometimes as a point of resistance, sometimes as a foundation for pride, sometimes as a wound that is not yet healed. The global South, shaped in part by the structures of empire, continues to grapple with questions of development and justice that trace back to colonial histories. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the British Empire is its role in creating the modern interconnected world. The empire was not the only force in globalization, but it was a central one, building networks of trade, migration, communication, and culture that spanned the globe. The empire created inequalities and injustices, but it also linked continents and peoples in ways that continue to shape the 21st century. The internet, global finance, international law, and world politics all bear marks of the imperial age, whether in the dominance of English, the borders of modern states, or the institutions of global governance influenced by British models. To tell the story of the British Empire, then, is to tell the story of power, ambition, and contradiction. It is the story of how a small island kingdom became the largest empire in history, how it brought wealth and innovation but also suffering and exploitation, how it reshaped the world, and then gave way to new powers. The empire no longer exists, but its legacy lives on. In the Commonwealth, in the English language, in migration and multiculturalism, in conflicts and in connections. The British Empire was not a simple story of triumph or tragedy, but a vast, complex, and enduring chapter in human history. Its echoes are everywhere in the institutions we use, the languages we speak, the borders we live within, and the debates we continue to have about justice, memory, and identity. Today, when we look at the world, we can still see the traces of the empire that once claimed the sun never set upon it. From cricket pitches in Mumbai to courtrooms in Nairobi, from parliaments in the Caribbean to financial districts in London, the British Empire lives on in both visible and invisible ways. It is remembered with pride by some, with anger by others, but it cannot be ignored. The entire history of the British Empire is a story of rise and fall, of dominance and decline, of connection and division. And though the empire itself has ended, its history continues to shape the present and will continue to shape the future, reminding us that the legacies of empire are never truly past, but always part of the ongoing story of humanity.